She ran into the one alley in the city with no cameras, no witnesses, and no way out. What waited for her there wasn't death, even though death was what she expected. It was a man who had been alive for 3 centuries, and 4 words said so quietly she almost didn't hear them over her own heartbeat. "Don't scream. I won't hurt you." She believed him before she understood why, and the single word she gave him in return, meant as nothing more than survival, would crown her by sunrise. Wren Calloway had learned to run quietly. 3 months of practice did that, taught her feet which cracks in the pavement creaked, and which alleys dead ended. She'd memorized 6 routes home, and used 4 this week alone. It hadn't mattered. They'd found her anyway. 2 men had been leaning against the brick wall outside Sal's diner when her shift ended at 11. Marcus, and a man she knew only by the scar through his eyebrow. They worked for Dominic Reyes, who ran half the unlicensed lending in this part of the city, and Wren owed him $11,000 she didn't have. Money that had gone to hospital bills for her brother before anyone explained the loan came with men attached. Men who waited outside her apartment. Men whose patience had run out. She'd slipped through the kitchen, out the back, into the gap in the fence the cooks used for smoke breaks. For 2 blocks, she thought she'd lost them. Her lungs burned in the cold, her cheap shoes already blistering her heels. But stopping wasn't a choice that existed for her. Eli was 14, and Eli had a heart condition that needed monitoring and medication, and twice now, emergency surgery their mother's insurance hadn't covered after she died. Their father had been gone since Wren was 9. It had been Wren and Eli alone for 4 years, Wren working every shift she could get, signing papers she shouldn't have signed because the alternative was watching her brother's heart give out while she did nothing. The alley she turned into wasn't supposed to be a mistake. She'd used it before, a narrow gap between a shuttered hardware store and an apartment building letting out onto Birch Street, usually full of foot traffic, even this late. Tonight the streetlight at the far end was dark, and by the time she realized a delivery truck blocked the exit, it was too late to turn around. Footsteps behind her. Unhurried. The kind that came from men who knew exactly how trapped she was. "You made this harder than it needed to be," Marcus said, his voice carrying easily in the narrow space. "Dominic just wants to talk." Wren pressed her back against the cold brick, feeling for anything her hand might close around, finding only damp stone and a stapled flyer. The scarred man reached her first, his hand closing around her arm hard enough that she knew there'd be a bruise by morning, if she lived to see it, and the sound from her throat was somewhere between a word and a scream, the kind that wouldn't carry past a dead end even if anyone had been listening. Let go of her. The voice came from nowhere, low and even, like someone commenting on weather rather than stopping an assault. Marcus and the scarred man both turned, and for one suspended second, nobody moved. A man stood at the mouth of the alley, where there had been no man a moment ago, where the truck still blocked the only way out, and yet somehow he was simply there. Dark clothes, nothing about him that should have read as dangerous, yet something in his stillness made the scarred man's grip tighten on her arm again, this time from instinct rather than aggression. "This isn't your business," Marcus said, his confidence thinning. "I'm making it my business." The stranger stepped forward, and the dead streetlight flickered, lighting his face for a second before going dark again. Pale skin, dark eyes holding more light than the dead bulb had any right to give off. A stillness that didn't belong to anything human, though Wren wouldn't finish that thought, not with a hand still bruising her arm. Marcus reached for something at his waist, and the stranger moved. Wren would spend weeks afterward trying to describe what happened next, and never manage it, because there wasn't a way to explain something too fast for human eyes to track as anything but a single blurred event. One moment the stranger was 10 feet away. The next, the scarred man's grip vanished from her arm, the man sliding down the wall in a heap that didn't move, and Marcus was on his knees, pinned by a hand at his collar that hadn't been visible half a second before. "Tell Dominic Reyes," the stranger said, still calm, "that this debt is paid. All of it. And tell him that if he sends anyone near this woman again, I will not be this patient." Marcus made a sound that might have been agreement. The stranger released him, and Marcus scrambled backward, dragging his companion by the collar, disappearing around the truck without looking back. And then it was just the two of them. Wren pressed against the brick wall, heart slamming against her ribs, and the man who had appeared from nowhere and dismantled two armed men in seconds, watching her with an expression she couldn't read in the dark. "Don't scream," he said quietly, taking one slow step closer, hands empty at his sides, a posture matching nothing else about him. "I won't hurt you. I promise you that. Whatever you think just happened, whatever you think I am not going to hurt you." Wren opened her mouth and nothing came out. Not a scream, not a word, just air, shaking, and the strange, distant realization that some part of her already believed him. "My name is Alaric," he said, when the silence had stretched long enough that she'd started to shake from more than cold. "Alaric Kane. I won't touch you unless you ask me to. I won't follow you if you walk away right now. But I don't think you should walk away alone, not tonight, and not in those shoes." Wren looked down at her shoes as if she'd forgotten they existed, as if her own feet belonged to someone else. The adrenaline that had carried her through the chase and the alley was draining out of her all at once, leaving something hollow and shaking in its place. Her knees buckled before she decided to let them, and she found herself sliding down the brick wall to sit on the cold ground, the same wall Marcus had pinned her against minutes before. Alaric didn't move toward her at all. He crouched at a distance, putting himself at her eye level without closing the space between them, and waited quietly. "What are you?" Wren finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Something you have a word for already," he said. "You just don't want to say it, because saying it makes it real, and you've had enough real things happen tonight." "Vampire." The word came out of her like something foreign, something she'd only used to describe movies and books. Never a man crouched 6 feet away in a dead-end alley with blood that wasn't his own cooling on the pavement nearby. "Vampire," Alaric agreed simply. She waited for fear to arrive the way it should have, the way every story she'd ever absorbed told her it would. But what came instead was a strange, bone-deep exhaustion, the kind that made monsters feel almost beside the point when she'd already spent 3 months running from men who didn't need fangs to be dangerous. "You saved me," she said slowly, testing the words. I intervened. His voice carried something careful in it, like he was choosing not to take credit for more than the facts supported. "What you do with that is yours to decide. I'm not asking for gratitude, or anything else. I heard you running. I heard your heart, actually, before I heard your feet, and it was beating like something that knew it was about to die. I came to see why. You can hear heartbeats from blocks away when I'm listening for them." He paused. "It's not usually something I bother with. The city is full of frightened heartbeats. Most of them aren't actually in danger. Yours was." Wren pulled her knees up to her chest, wrapping her arms around them, a posture she recognized as one she'd used 100 times in the months since Eli's last hospital bill arrived. Dominic isn't going to just let this go because you told his guys to say something to him. Men like that don't forgive a debt because someone scarier shows up once. "Dominic Reyes will let it go," Alaric said, "because by morning he'll understand exactly who delivered that message, and men like him have survived as long as they have by knowing which fights end careers and which fights end lives." Something in his tone made it clear which category this fell into. I'm not telling you this to frighten you. I'm telling you because you deserve to know you're not in danger from him anymore. Not tonight, not next week, not ever again if I have any say in it. Why would you have any say in it at all? The question came out sharper than she intended. 3 months of suspicion finally finding a target that wasn't running away from her. You don't know me. You don't owe me anything. People don't dismantle 2 armed men and offer to handle a citywide loan shark because of a heartbeat they didn't like. Alaric considered this for a long moment, his dark eyes steady on hers in a way that should have felt invasive and somehow didn't. You're right, he said finally. It's not really about the heartbeat. I've lived a long time, Ren Calloway, long enough that very little surprises me, and even less moves me to act without calculation first. But I heard fear that had been going on for months, not minutes, and underneath it, something that hadn't given up yet. That's rarer than you'd think. I wanted to see it before it was gone. She didn't know what to do with that, so she said nothing, and the alley settled into a silence that felt less dangerous than it had any right to. I have somewhere safe, Alaric said eventually. Not far from here. You don't have to come. I can call a car to take you wherever you'd feel safe instead. Your apartment, a friend's place, anywhere you choose. But I don't think your apartment is safe tonight, even with Dominic handled. Because handled doesn't happen instantly, and his men know where you live. Ren thought of her empty apartment 3 blocks from here, the deadbolt that didn't quite catch, the window that didn't lock at all, and Eli sleeping at their aunt's place across town because she hadn't wanted him home alone while she worked nights. She thought of the particular fear that came from realizing she had nowhere that actually qualified as safe. She thought of the casual, terrifying ease with which this man had ended a threat she'd carried like a physical weight for 3 months, and how exhausted she was, how her body had stopped offering her any more adrenaline to keep running on. Okay, she said, and the word felt enormous leaving her mouth, far larger than 2 syllables should have been able to hold. Okay, take me somewhere safe. She didn't know yet that the word would mean more than she intended, that somewhere in his world's careful architecture, a word like that one given freely to someone like him was rarely just a word. The car that picked them up wasn't flashy, a dark sedan with tinted windows and a driver who didn't ask a single question about why his employer was bringing home a barefoot woman in a torn dress at midnight. Ren sat with her knees pulled to her chest the entire ride, watching the city slide past the window in streaks of color, watching the streets grow wider and quieter and cleaner the farther they drove from the diner, from Dominic's territory, from the version of her life that had existed 3 hours ago. You're not what I expected, she said eventually, mostly to fill the silence. What did you expect? I don't know. Capes? Coffins? Something more dramatic than a sedan with leather seats. Something that might have been a small smile flickered at the corner of his mouth, there and gone too quickly to be entirely sure of it. The capes went out of fashion around the same time gas lamps did. I adapted. The house, when they reached it, sat at the end of a private drive lined with old trees, set back far enough from the road that the city's noise dropped away entirely, replaced by something Ren hadn't heard in months. Actual quiet. Stone and dark wood, windows lit warm and gold from within. A house that looked like it had been standing for longer than most of the buildings she'd grown up around, because it had. How long have you lived here? She asked as he led her up the front steps. Since the house was built. 1860-something. I've renovated the plumbing more times than I care to count, but the bones are the same. Inside, a woman met them in the entryway, older, silver-haired, dressed like she'd been awake and working despite the hour, which she clearly had been. She took one look at Ren's bare, bleeding feet and the state of her dress, and didn't ask a single question either. Just disappeared down a hallway and returned a few minutes later with a basin of warm water, bandages, and a stack of folded clothes that looked soft, and worn in the way that came from being washed 100 times. "This is Greta," Alaric said. "She's run this house longer than most countries have run their governments. Greta, this is Ren. She'll be staying with us for a while." Greta's eyes flicked toward Alaric with something sharp and assessing in them, gone again before Ren could fully read it, replaced by the same brisk kindness she turned on Ren a second later. "Sit," she said, gesturing to a chair near the fire that had clearly been lit recently, though Ren hadn't seen anyone light it. "Let's see your feet before you track blood across my floors." The warm water stung against the cuts and blisters, but it was the kind of sting that came from healing rather than harm, and Ren found herself watching Greta's careful, efficient hands instead of thinking about anything else, which was probably the point. Alaric stood near the window, not hovering exactly, but present, watching the dark trees outside with the particular stillness of someone who'd spent centuries learning patience. "You don't have to stand guard," Ren said. "Old habit." He didn't turn around. "I'll stop if it bothers you." It doesn't. It should have, she thought. A stranger, a vampire, watching over her like something he'd decided was worth protecting. In a house she'd never seen before, on a night that had already broken every rule she'd built her survival around. It should have terrified her more than it did. Instead, there was something almost familiar about it, something her body recognized even if her mind hadn't caught up yet. The specific relief of not being the only person keeping watch for once. When Greta finished and excused herself for the night, the house settled into a deeper quiet. Just the fire and the old wood creaking, and the two of them in a room that suddenly felt smaller than it had a few minutes ago. "There's a room upstairs," Alaric said. "Made up already. You don't have to talk to me anymore tonight if you don't want to. You don't have to explain anything you're not ready to explain." "My brother," Ren said instead, because it had been sitting heavy in her chest the entire ride, the one thing she couldn't set down even surrounded by warmth and quiet and a fire she hadn't asked for. "Eli. He's 14. He's at our aunt's tonight, but I need him to know I'm okay. I need to see him tomorrow. I can't just disappear on him. Not after everything, then you'll see him tomorrow." Alaric said it simply, like it required no negotiation at all. "I can have you driven there in the morning, or wherever you need to go. You're not a prisoner here, Ren. You're not required to stay a single hour longer than you want to." She studied his face for the lie she expected to find there, and didn't find one. "Why does any of this matter to you? I'm a stranger you found in an alley. Tomorrow, I could be gone, and you'd never have to think about me again." "I could," he agreed, "but I don't think I will." He finally turned from the window, and in the firelight his eyes looked less like something carved from ice, and more like something tired. Something that had been waiting a very long time for a reason to stop being so careful. It's been a long time since anything in this house felt like it mattered beyond keeping it running. Tonight, for the first time in longer than I'd like to admit, something did. Ren didn't have an answer for that, so she let Greta's borrowed clothes and the dying fire and the unfamiliar safety of the room carry her upstairs instead, already wondering what tomorrow would ask of her that tonight hadn't. Morning came through unfamiliar curtains, gold and quiet, and for a few disoriented seconds, Ren forgot where she was entirely. Forgot the alley, and the running, and the man with eyes that held more light than they should have. Then it all came back at once, the way it always did. The cold brick in Marcus's grip, and the impossible speed of a stranger who had introduced himself with a name instead of a threat, and she lay there for a long moment just breathing in a room that smelled like cedar and clean linen, instead of the mildew and stale grease that had soaked into every corner of her apartment for years. She found Alaric in a kitchen that looked too modern for the rest of the house, all warm wood and quiet steel, and Greta already at the stove despite the early hour. He'd changed from the dark clothes of the night before into something simpler. sleeves rolled to his forearms, and the sight of him in daylight struck her differently than the version she'd built in her head overnight. Less impossible, more tired, in a way that had nothing to do with sleep, since she was beginning to understand he didn't need much of it. "There's coffee," he said, without looking up from whatever he was reading on the table in front of him. And Greta made too much breakfast, as she does whenever there's someone new in the house to feed. "I heard that," Greta said from the stove, not turning around either. Ren sat across from him, accepting the mug Greta set in front of her, and for a few minutes nobody said anything important. Just the clink of dishes and the low murmur of a radio somewhere, and the strange, fragile sensation of being somewhere that didn't feel like it might fall apart the second she relaxed. "I called the number Greta gave me last night," Ren said finally. "My aunt. Eli knows I'm safe. He wants to see me. Then you'll see him." Alaric set down whatever he'd been reading. "I'll have you driven there whenever you're ready. And Ren, I should tell you something before you go, so you're not caught off guard by anything Dominic's people might still try." She set down her mug. "I thought you said it was handled. It is, mostly. Men like Dominic don't usually risk a second confrontation with something they don't understand, and by now, he understands exactly what he ran into in that alley. But mostly isn't entirely. And I'd rather you know what you're dealing with than discover it without warning." He paused, choosing his next words with the kind of care that told her this mattered more than he was letting on. "I'm not just someone with money and an unusual constitution, Ren. I hold territory in this city. Vampires answer to me here, the same way certain things in this city answer to people like Dominic, except my version of that arrangement goes back considerably further and reaches considerably wider." "Territory," Ren repeated slowly, turning the word over in her mind. "Like a king. The word gets used. Yes, I don't love it, but it's accurate enough." He watched her carefully, gauging her reaction the way someone braces for a blow they're not entirely sure is coming. "I'm telling you this because being seen with me, staying in this house, accepting any kind of help from me, puts you somewhere on a map that other people pay attention to. Dominic backing off doesn't mean nobody else notices a human living under my protection. I'd rather you decide what you want to do with that information with your eyes open than have it explained to you by someone with worse intentions than mine." Ren turned this over carefully, the way she'd learned to turn over every piece of information that touched her life since Marcus's first late payment notice arrived, weighing it for the trap that always seemed to be hiding somewhere underneath good news. "Are you saying I'm in more danger now, not less?" "I'm saying the danger changes shape. Dominic was a threat with a name and a price tag. What replaces him, if anything does, would be something with longer history and less predictable motives." He held her gaze steadily. "I won't pretend that's a small thing, but I also won't let anything happen to you because of a choice you made to accept help from me. That's not a promise I make lightly, and it's not one I intend to break." "Why?" Ren asked. The same question she'd asked in the alley, the one she still hadn't gotten an answer to that made complete sense, the one that kept circling back no matter how many times she tried to set it down. "Does protecting me matter enough to take on that kind of trouble?" Alaric was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer at all, his gaze fixed somewhere past her shoulder. 300 years is a long time to watch people come and go, he said finally. Long enough to stop expecting anything to surprise you. You did, last night. Not because you needed saving, though you did, but because of what was underneath the fear. I told you that already. I haven't stopped meaning it in the daylight." He pushed back from the table. "Eat something before the car comes. Greta will be insulted otherwise. And trust me, you don't want Greta insulted." Ren almost laughed, the sound surprising her as much as it seemed to surprise him. A small fracture of normal in a morning that had no business feeling as normal as it did, sitting in a stranger's kitchen with a stranger's coffee warming her hands. She picked up her fork, and for the length of one quiet breakfast, the weight she'd been carrying for 3 months felt impossibly a little lighter than it had in longer than she could remember. 3 weeks folded into something that almost resembled a life. Wren kept her shifts at the diner because Alaric never once suggested she shouldn't, never tried to fold her into dependence the way she'd half expected from a man with that much power and that much money. Instead, he simply made sure a car was available when she needed one, made sure the house was there when she came back to it, made sure Greta kept a plate warm on the nights her shift ran late. Small things. Things that added up slowly, day after day, to something she didn't have a name for yet, something that felt dangerously close to safety after 3 months of having none at all. Eli visited every Sunday. The first time, he'd stood in the entryway of the house with his mouth slightly open, taking in the stone and the dark wood and the fire that was always lit no matter the hour, and asked, with the bluntness only a 14-year-old could manage, "Is this guy your boyfriend, or like a sugar daddy, or what?" "Neither," Wren had said, quite mortified, while across the room Alaric made a sound that might have been the first real laugh she'd heard out of him. "He's a friend," she amended quietly, though even as she said it the word felt too small for whatever this was becoming. "He helped me. He's letting me stay here while things settle." Eli, it turned out, asked fewer questions than she expected once he understood the one fact that actually mattered to a teenager whose entire world had narrowed down to survival the same way Wren's had. Nobody was hurting his sister anymore. He warmed to Alaric slowly, the way Eli warmed to everything, with careful observation before commitment, and by the 3rd Sunday, he'd started bringing his homework along with him, spreading it across the kitchen table while Alaric, of all things, helped him with a chemistry assignment, with the patient precision of someone who'd apparently watched the periodic table get built one element at a time. "You're good with him," Wren said quietly one evening, after Eli had gone home and the house had settled into its usual nighttime quiet. "He's easy to be good with. He's curious and he's brave, and he hasn't let any of what happened to the two of you make him cruel. That's rarer than people think, growing up the way he has." Alaric was quiet for a moment, looking at nothing in particular, his expression somewhere far away. "I had a brother once, a long time ago, before any of this." He gestured vaguely at himself, at the centuries the gesture was meant to encompass. "He didn't survive what made me what I am. I think about him more than I let myself say out loud, even after all this time." "What happened?" "The same thing that's always happened, in one form or another, since long before either of us was born. Someone wanted power. Someone else paid for it." He didn't elaborate further, and Wren didn't push, recognizing the particular shape of a grief that hadn't finished healing even after centuries of trying, a grief she understood better now than she had 3 weeks ago. It was on nights like this that she found herself watching him differently, noticing the way exhaustion sat on someone who didn't need sleep the way ordinary people did, an exhaustion that lived somewhere deeper than the body, in the eyes, in the set of his shoulders. 300 years of losing things. 300 years of learning not to expect to keep anything for long. She thought about how easily he'd told her that on the first night, how he'd said it almost like a warning, and wondered now if it had also been something else entirely. A confession. The medical bill arrived on a Tuesday, forwarded from her old address by a neighbor who still had her new number. Eli's last cardiology follow-up, the one she'd scheduled before any of this happened, before Dominic's debt was paid and her life rearranged itself around a man she still didn't fully understand. $4,000 she didn't have, on top of everything else, the kind of number that used to send her into a particular cold panic she'd almost forgotten the shape of these past few weeks, a panic that lived in her chest and her stomach and the backs of her teeth all at once. She didn't mention it. She'd decided, somewhere in the last 3 weeks, that she wasn't going to be the kind of person who let Alaric's generosity become a habit she leaned on for everything, who quietly turned a man who'd saved her life into a permanent solution for every problem that followed it. She folded the bill into her bag and told herself she'd figure it out the way she'd figured everything else out, one shift at a time. She didn't know, until Greta mentioned it in passing 3 days later while folding laundry in the hallway, that the bill had already been paid in full, quietly, before it had even reached Wren's hands. She found Alaric in his study that evening, the crumpled bill clutched in her fist, fully prepared to be angry about it. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know." He didn't look up from the book in his lap. "I wanted to. That's not the same thing." "No," he agreed, finally meeting her eyes. "It isn't, but Wren, I've spent 300 years with more money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes, and nothing worth spending it on. Let me have this. Let your brother's heart be one less thing you have to carry alone." Something in his voice, low and unguarded in a way she rarely heard from him, made the anger in her chest falter, then dissolve into something else entirely. Something that scared her considerably more than debt ever had. The first sign that something had shifted came on a Thursday, in the form of a man Wren had never seen before, standing across the street from the diner when she finished her shift. Not approaching, not threatening, just watching with the patient stillness of someone gathering information rather than preparing to act. She didn't recognize him from Dominic's crew. He was paler than that, dressed too well for street muscle, his coat too fine for the neighborhood, and when she mentioned him to Alaric that night, something in her husband's expression— no, not husband, she corrected herself quickly. Something in Alaric's expression went carefully, deliberately blank, the kind of blankness that meant the opposite of nothing. "Describe him again," he said. She did, as best she could remember. Alaric was quiet for a long moment afterward, his jaw tight in a way she'd learned meant he was working through several unpleasant possibilities at once. "That wasn't one of Dominic's," he said finally. "That was a Marin." "A what?" "A surname. Not a species, though I understand why you'd ask." He set down the book he'd been holding without reading, a tell she'd come to recognize over the past weeks, a small habit that meant something had unsettled him more than his voice would admit. "Lady Celine Marin holds territory 2 cities over. She's old, older than me by a fair margin, and she spent the better part of a decade looking for a reason to expand her reach into mine. A human under my protection, especially one with no formal standing, no legal claim to that protection beyond my word, is exactly the kind of opening she's been waiting for." Wren felt something cold settle low in her stomach. The particular dread of watching a problem she thought was solved reveal itself to be only the first layer of something larger. "What does that mean for me?" "It means Dominic Reyes isn't finished. Not really. He's smart enough not to come at me directly again, but he's also exactly the kind of desperate, humiliated man Celine Marin would find useful. A human source inside my territory with a personal grudge and nothing left to lose. I'd put money on the two of them having already found each other, if they haven't yet." Alaric's voice stayed level, but Wren had learned to hear the things he kept carefully out of his tone over these past weeks, and what she heard now, underneath the careful calm, was something close to fear. An emotion she hadn't been entirely sure he was still capable of feeling after 3 centuries. "So what do we do?" "There's a law," Alaric said slowly. "The way a man chooses his footing on ice he isn't certain will hold his weight. Old, older than most of the territories that still operate under it, including mine. It allows a lord to formally bind a human under his protection, not informally, the way you are now, but permanently, in a way that no other vampire, no court, no rival lord can challenge or undo. It would close the opening Celine's looking for entirely. There would be nothing left for her to exploit, nothing left to use against either of us. What does binding mean? It means asking for your protection becomes more than a request I can grant or withdraw at will. It becomes law. It becomes something woven into what I am, not just what I do. He hesitated, and the hesitation itself told her something. A held-back piece of information she could feel the shape of, even without seeing it directly. A weight behind his eyes he wasn't ready to set down in front of her yet. It requires your consent, freely given, spoken aloud. That's the only requirement. A single word, given honestly, is enough to make it permanent. That sounds simple for something you're being this careful and this slow about explaining. It's an old law, he said again, and this time she noticed he hadn't actually answered her. Old laws carry more weight than new ones expect them to. I'd rather you understand the gravity of it than think this is something small. But you're not telling me everything. It wasn't a question. 3 months of reading Marcus's silences for the truths he wouldn't say outright had taught her how to recognize the shape of an omission, even when she couldn't name what was missing from it. Alaric met her eyes, and for the first time since the alley, she watched something that looked almost like guilt move across his face. There are details, he admitted, that I don't fully understand myself, not with certainty, and I'd rather not frighten you with possibilities that may not even apply to someone like you. What I do know, what matters, is that it would make you untouchable to Celine Marin, to Dominic, to anyone who might think a human in my house is an opportunity rather than a person under my protection. And if I say yes to all of this, then you're safer than you have ever been in your entire life. He paused, and something passed behind his eyes that she couldn't fully read, something that looked almost like longing wrapped tightly around the careful caution. And nothing changes between us beyond that. I'm not asking for anything you haven't already chosen to give me these past few weeks. I'm asking you to let me protect you in a way that can't ever be undone by anyone but you. Ren thought of the man across the street, the cold patience in his watching, the particular helplessness of being a target in a game whose rules she didn't fully understand and had no way to learn quickly enough to protect herself. She thought of Eli, of Sundays at the kitchen table, of a life that had finally started to feel like something worth protecting, worth fighting to keep. Okay, she said. Tell me what to say. They performed it that same night, because Alaric said waiting only gave Celine Marin more time to find an opening they hadn't closed yet, and because Ren, once she'd made up her mind about something, had never been good at sitting with a decision instead of acting on it immediately. He led her to the study, cleared the low table near the fire, and lit candles in a way that felt less like ceremony and more like practicality. Light enough to see by in a room where the lamps had been deliberately left dark for the occasion. Tell me again, slowly, exactly what I'm agreeing to, she said, sitting across from him on the floor, the fire warm against one side of her face. You're agreeing to my protection, formally and permanently, in a way recognized by every court and every lord who might otherwise question it. You're agreeing to let me be responsible for your safety in the eyes of my kind, the way I already am, in every way that matters to me personally. He took her hands in his skin cool the way it always was, steady the way it always was. I'll ask you a question. If you mean to accept, you say yes. That's all. There's no ritual beyond the words themselves. The law doesn't require blood or ceremony, only honesty. And if I say no to all of it, then nothing changes. You stay here, under my protection exactly as it exists now, and we find another way to handle Celine Marin. I won't think less of you for choosing caution. I'd probably think more of you for it, honestly, given everything you've already survived these past months without anyone's help at all. Ren looked at his hands around hers, steady and certain in a way nothing in her life had been in longer than she could remember, and thought about the man across the street, the cold patience of him, and the particular exhaustion of spending years bracing for a blow that never quite stopped coming, no matter how far she ran. She thought about Eli's heart, about Sunday afternoons at the kitchen table, about a fire that was always lit, no matter what hour she came home, "Ask me," she said. Alaric's eyes held hers, dark and steady, and when he spoke his voice had dropped into something older, something that carried weight she hadn't heard from him before, a cadence that belonged to a different century entirely. "Wren Calloway, do you accept my protection, freely and without coercion, for as long as you shall need it?" The question hung there in the firelight between them, simple words asking for something that didn't feel simple at all, and Wren understood, in the half-second before she answered, that some part of her had already decided this weeks ago. Somewhere between the chemistry homework and the paid medical bill and the particular safety of falling asleep in a house where someone else was always awake and watching for danger so she didn't have to. "Yes," she said. The word left her mouth ordinary, just a sound, just 3 letters, and for one full breath nothing happened at all, the fire crackling the same as it had a moment before, the candles burning steady, and she almost laughed quietly at how anticlimactic it felt, how small the moment seemed compared to the weight Alaric had clearly been carrying around it. Then, the room changed. It wasn't loud. It wasn't violent. It was more like the air itself had taken a breath and held it, a pressure building behind her sternum that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with something ancient recognizing itself. Something old and vast settling into place the way a key settles into a lock built specifically, centuries ago, for its exact shape. Wren's vision blurred at the edges, gold light pooling where there shouldn't have been light at all, and a warmth spread from her chest outward, down her arms, into the hands Alaric still held. A warmth that felt less like heat and more like recognition, like coming home to somewhere she'd never actually been before. Alaric's grip on her hands tightened suddenly, and when she looked up at him, his expression had gone from careful to something close to alarm, his dark eyes wide in a way she'd never seen them before, not even in the alley, not even facing down armed men twice his apparent size. "Wren," he said, her name coming out strange, urgent. "Wren, look at your hand." She looked down, where his fingers had been resting against the inside of her wrist. A mark had begun to bloom beneath her skin, dark and intricate, spreading like frost across glass, like ink dropped slowly into still water, settling into a shape too detailed and too deliberate to be anything but designed. A crest she didn't recognize but somehow already understood, on some level deeper than language, belonged to him. "That's not supposed to happen," Alaric said quietly, and there was something in his voice now that hadn't been there a moment ago, something that sounded impossibly, almost like fear, the same fear she'd heard underneath his calm when he first told her about Celine Marin. "Wren, that mark, the way it's settling into your skin, that's not a protection binding. That's something else entirely. Something I haven't seen take hold in longer than I care to admit." The warmth in her chest hadn't faded at all. If anything, it had deepened, settling into something that felt less like a stranger's magic and more like it had always belonged there, patiently waiting for this exact moment to arrive. Wren stared at the mark spreading across her wrist, beautiful and terrifying in equal measure, and felt the first cold thread of understanding settle over her, that whatever she'd just agreed to, it was not the thing Alaric had asked her about at all. Alaric didn't sleep that night, not that he ever needed to, but Wren noticed he didn't even pretend to settle into the careful stillness she'd come to recognize as his version of rest. He paced the study until dawn, made calls in low, urgent tones she couldn't fully decipher from the guest room down the hall, and by the time she came downstairs, hollow-eyed and still wearing the mark on her wrist like a secret she hadn't agreed to keep, his expression had settled into something grim and resolved, the look of a man bracing for a conversation he'd been dreading since the moment he first met her. "I called an old friend," he said, before she'd even reached the kitchen. "Someone who's studied the binding laws longer than I've been alive. I needed to be certain before I told you anything. because I wasn't going to frighten you with a guess. Tell me now." He gestured for her to sit, and for a long moment he didn't, just stood by the window with his back to her the way he had that very first morning, except nothing about this felt like that morning at all. The protection binding I described to you exists. It's real, and it's exactly what I told you it does. But there's an older law beneath it, one most lords forget even exists, because it requires conditions that almost never align. It activates not through the words spoken, but through what's actually meant underneath them, on both sides, at the same moment. What does that mean? It means the binding doesn't read intention from me alone. It reads it from both of us, equally, weighing both sides against each other. And when two people ask and answer that question with feelings that go beyond protection, beyond gratitude, beyond anything either of them has actually said out loud yet, the law recognizes something else entirely, something neither of us put into motion on purpose. He turned to face her, and the look on his face was something she'd never seen there before, something raw underneath the careful composure he usually wore, like armor. "Ren, you're not protected under my house anymore. You're bound to me as my consort. In the eyes of every vampire court that recognizes the old laws, you're my queen." The word landed in the kitchen like something dropped from a great height, shattering the careful quiet of the morning into something jagged. Ren sat very still, the mark on her wrist suddenly heavier than it had felt an hour ago, heavier than anything should have been able to feel against skin. You knew this could happen. It wasn't a question, not really, more an accusation forming in real time as she said it, the words sharper than she'd meant them to come out. You said there were details you didn't understand with certainty. You knew this was possible, and you let me say yes to it anyway. I suspected. I didn't know. Not for certain. And I genuinely want you to believe that. Because it's true. His voice had gone rough, something close to desperate threading through the careful control he'd held onto all morning. This law hasn't activated in longer than I've been alive, Rain. I've read about it the way you'd read about a meteor strike, as something theoretical, something that happens to other people in other centuries. I told myself the odds were too small to frighten you with before we'd even tried. You should have told me, no matter how small the odds seemed. Her voice cracked despite her effort to keep it steady. You should have let me decide that for myself instead of deciding for me what I could handle hearing. Do you understand what that feels like, Alaric? Someone making choices about what I'm capable of without asking me first? I've lived that exact nightmare already. I left a man who did that to me. The comparison landed exactly as hard as she meant it to, and she watched it land. Watched something in his face crumple under the weight of it before he caught himself, and straightened again. Jaw tight, eyes bright, with something that looked dangerously close to grief. You're right, he said quietly. I have no defense for that. I was afraid of losing the only good thing that's happened to me in 3 centuries, and I let that fear make a decision that should have been yours alone to make. I'm sorry, not for what happened, because I can't be sorry for something I don't fully understand or regret, but for not trusting you with the truth before it happened to you without your knowledge. Ren pressed her palms against the cool kitchen counter, grounding herself in something solid, while everything else about her life rearranged itself around a word she hadn't known was loaded the way it apparently had been. Queen, the word, belonged in stories, in history books, in the kind of fantasy she'd stopped believing in. Around the same time, she'd stopped believing anyone would ever choose her over the version of safety that came easiest. It didn't belong to a waitress with blistered feet and a brother with a bad heart and $11,000 of debt that had only just stopped following her. What happens now? She asked, because someone had to ask, and the silence had stretched long enough that she couldn't bear carrying it alone anymore. What does being your queen actually mean, beyond the word itself? Alaric crossed the kitchen and knelt in front of her chair, an act of deference she hadn't expected from a man who held territory the way other men held citizenship, and took her marked wrist gently in both hands, as if it might shatter if he wasn't careful with it. "It means," he said quietly, "that every single thing I told you about danger gets exponentially more complicated, and exponentially more important to get right, starting tonight." The summons came 3 days later, delivered by a courier who arrived at the house in formal black and addressed Wren as Your Majesty, with a straight face that made her want to either laugh or be sick. She genuinely hadn't decided which yet. The Council of Eastern Territories wanted to meet the human who had triggered a binding nobody alive had witnessed actually happen, and Alaric explained, with the careful patience of a man delivering news he already knew she wouldn't want to hear, that attendance wasn't optional. Not for either of them. Not this time. "They'll want to test you," he said the night before, helping her into a dress Greta had produced from somewhere, with the same brisk efficiency she handled everything else in that house. Deep green silk. Simple but unmistakably formal. Nothing like anything Wren had worn in her life before this one began. Not physically. They'll ask questions designed to find cracks, designed to prove you're not what the binding claims you are. Some of them have spent centuries believing humans are beneath formal recognition entirely. They won't enjoy being told otherwise by a law older than their objections to it. And if I crack under this, you won't crack. He said it without hesitation, the kind of certainty that should have felt presumptuous, and instead felt like an anchor holding steady against a current. But if you did, it wouldn't matter. The binding doesn't ask their permission. It already happened. Tomorrow isn't about earning something you already have. It's about making them say so out loud. They hadn't fully repaired things between them since the kitchen. Not really. Not the rawest parts of it. Though the days since had softened the edges considerably, the way a wound starts to close even while it's still healing underneath. Wren had watched him work, watched him quietly rearrange his entire territory's security around protecting her, watched him sit up 3 nights running studying ancient texts for anything that might tell them more about a law that had apparently decided, entirely on its own, that the two of them belonged to each other. She hadn't forgiven him for the omission. Not completely. She'd started to understand it, which wasn't quite the same thing, but was its own kind of progress, the kind that mattered. The council chamber, when they arrived the next evening, looked exactly like the kind of place built to make people feel small on purpose. Stone arches older than most countries, a long table carved from dark wood worn smooth by centuries of hands. A dozen vampires arranged around it, with the particular ancient stillness Wren had learned to associate with creatures who'd stopped needing to perform urgency centuries ago. Alaric kept his hand at the small of her back as they entered, a steady pressure that said, without a single word, "You are not alone in this room, whatever happens next." Lord Kane, the eldest among them, spoke first, a woman whose age showed not in her face, but in the weight behind her eyes. Something that had clearly seen empires rise and crumble and found neither one particularly remarkable. "You bring us a curiosity." "I bring you my queen," Alaric said, and Wren heard the steel underneath the courtesy of his tone. "I'd asked the council to address her as such." A ripple moved through the room, not quite a murmur, something more contained than that, but still entirely unmistakable to anyone paying attention. One of the younger lords, dark-haired and visibly skeptical, leaned forward in his seat. "The binding is recognized in theory. Whether it should be recognized in practice, for a human with no lineage, no formal training, no real understanding of what she's actually agreed to, is a separate question entirely, and one this council has every right to ask." "Ask her your questions, then," Alaric said. "Directly. She's capable of answering for herself." The dark-haired lord turned his attention fully onto Wren, something testing in his expression. The particular cruelty of someone who enjoyed watching things break under pressure and called it diligence. Tell me, Queen Calloway, what do you know of vampire law? Of territory rights? Of blood debts? Of the obligations a consort carries to an entire court of people who never chose her, and likely never would have? Nothing, Wren said, before she'd fully decided to answer honestly, rather than try to fake a competence she didn't have and never would. I know nothing about any of that. 3 months ago, I knew how to balance a tray of dishes without dropping it, and how to stretch $11 across a week of groceries for myself and my brother. I don't have lineage. I don't have training. What I have is the fact that a law older than your objections looked at what's actually true between Alaric and me, and decided it mattered more than tradition does, more than centuries of precedent. The room had gone very quiet. The eldest woman's eyes had sharpened, something assessing in them now that hadn't been there before. What is actually true between you? She asked, leaning forward slightly herself now, in your own words, not the binding's words. Wren glanced at Alaric, who watched her with an expression she'd come to recognize over these past weeks, something that looked, impossibly, like hope laid bare in front of an entire room of strangers. That he saw me when nobody else had bothered to look in years. That he never once asked me to be smaller, or quieter, or easier to manage, the way everyone else in my life had asked, without ever saying it outright. That whatever this binding decided, it didn't invent something that wasn't already there between us. It just finally said it out loud, where everyone could hear it. The silence that followed her answer felt different than the one before it had, heavier in a way that had nothing to do with hostility at all. The call came on a Sunday afternoon, exactly the kind of ordinary hour that made the words on the other end of the line feel impossible to process at first. Wren's aunt, her voice high and frantic, saying Eli hadn't come home from the corner store, that he'd left 40 minutes ago for milk and bread and should have been back in 10. That she'd walked the route herself twice already and found nothing, no sign of him anywhere, no answer on his phone, nothing but an empty sidewalk and a growing certainty that something had gone terribly wrong. Wren's hands went cold around the receiver before her mind had even fully processed what was actually happening in real time. 3 months of conditioned fear surging back up through her chest, like something that had never actually left, only waited patiently for an excuse to return. Alaric was beside her before she'd finished relaying the words, his expression having shifted from concern to something harder, colder, the particular stillness of a predator calculating angles of attack before the first move had even been made. "Celine," he said, not a question at all, more a quiet confirmation of something he'd already suspected the moment the phone rang. This is exactly the kind of leverage she'd reach for, the kind that looks clean from a distance. Strike at the human family before striking at you directly. It's deniable. It puts the council in an impossible position if it actually works the way she's hoping. He's 14. He's just a child. I know. His voice had dropped into the register she'd heard only once before, the one from the night of the binding, the one that belonged to something far older and far more dangerous than the careful, gentle man who'd helped Eli with chemistry homework at the kitchen table every Sunday. And I am going to find him before the hour is out, or I am going to burn down every single person who decided touching him was an acceptable risk worth taking. The security network Alaric commanded moved faster than anything Rain had ever seen. Calls placed in low, rapid succession, a dozen names she didn't recognize given instructions in a tone that left no room for delay, hesitation, or excuse of any kind. Within 20 minutes, a location surfaced, a warehouse near the old shipping docks, a property quietly connected to a holding company that traced back, after 3 more calls and a name spoken with real venom, to someone Rain did recognize after all. Dominic Reyes, The name that had haunted 3 months of her life, resurfacing exactly when she'd thought it was over. He wouldn't have the resources for something like this alone, Alaric said, already moving toward the car, already shrugging into a coat that did nothing to disguise the violence radiating off him. In waves Ren could practically feel against her own skin from 3 feet away. Celine's funding him, almost certainly, using his grudge as convenient cover for her own ambitions in my territory. It doesn't matter whose idea it was first. It only matters that they have your brother, and that this ends within the hour, one way or another, completely. Ren rode in the car beside him in tense silence, hands clenched so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone completely white, and made herself ask the one question she needed answered before they actually arrived. "What happens when we finally get there?" she asked. "Finally, you stay in the car." His tone left absolutely no space for negotiation of any kind. "I mean that, Ren. Whatever you're picturing yourself doing inside that warehouse, set it down right now. You being safe is the only acceptable outcome that lets me focus completely on getting your brother out alive. And if something happens to you in there instead of him, then it happens to me, not to you or him. That's the calculation. It's the only one that matters tonight." He glanced at her once, something fierce and certain in his expression that left no room for argument. "I have spent 3 centuries learning exactly how dangerous I can be when something I care about is threatened. Tonight, you're going to watch me prove every bit of it." The warehouse sat dark against the waterfront. No visible guards anywhere along the perimeter, which told Ren nothing, except that whoever was inside had decided not to bother with human-scale precautions against a vampire lord who could move faster than any of them could possibly track. Alaric stopped the car 2 blocks out, took her hand once, briefly, pressing something cool and certain into her palm that felt like a promise rather than an object, and was gone before she'd fully registered him leaving the seat beside her, the door swinging shut behind nothing but empty air. The minutes that followed stretched into something with no relationship at all to actual time. Ren sat alone in the dark car, replaying every version of what could be happening behind those warehouse walls, picturing Eli's face, picturing the particular terror of a 14-year-old who'd already survived enough in his short life to know exactly how badly things could go when adults decided to use children as leverage. She thought about Marcus, about every moment she'd spent powerless against someone bigger and crueler than her, and hated, with a violence that surprised even her, how familiar this kind of waiting felt even now, even with everything in her life that had supposedly changed. 20 long minutes in, the warehouse door burst open from the inside. Ren's heart stopped entirely before it restarted at the sight of Eli, stumbling but upright, wrapped in Alaric's own coat. Alive, visibly terrified, but alive. And behind him, Alaric himself, blood at his collar that clearly wasn't his own. Carrying himself with the particular controlled fury of a man who had not yet finished being dangerous tonight. Not by a long stretch. Eli cried the entire ride home, the kind of crying a 14-year-old does when he's spent an hour being brave for strangers and finally has permission to stop pretending. Ren held him in the back seat, her own face wet against his hair, while Alaric drove in grim silence up front, his knuckles tight on the wheel, the adrenaline of the warehouse still visible in the rigid line of his shoulders, in the way his jaw stayed clenched the entire drive home. "They didn't hurt me at all," Eli kept saying, like he needed her to believe it fully before he could fully believe it himself. "They just locked me in a small room. Some guy asked me weird questions about you and the vampire stuff, and I didn't know what to say, so I just didn't say anything at all. You did exactly the right thing," Alaric said, his voice gentler now than it had been in the warehouse, gentler than Ren had heard it even at the kitchen table over chemistry homework. "You kept yourself safe. That's all that mattered tonight." "What happened to them?" Eli asked quietly. The guys who took me there? Alaric's eyes met Ren's once in the rearview mirror, a question and an answer passing between them without words. They won't ever be bothering anyone again, he said. Not Dominic, not the people he was working for. I made certain of it. He didn't elaborate further, and Eli, exhausted and shaking with the last of his adrenaline, didn't ask for more than that, too tired to push past the careful edges of what Alaric was willing to say out loud. Ren understood, in the careful weight of Alaric's silence, that whatever had happened in that warehouse had ended something permanently, and that he'd absorbed the cost of that ending, so neither she nor her brother would ever have to carry it themselves. Celine Marin sent a formal communication 3 days later, brief and coldly worded, denying any involvement in the warehouse incident and expressing carefully measured regret that an independent human criminal had apparently taken such drastic and unsanctioned action entirely on his own. Alaric read it once, set it aside without comment, and told Ren not to bother believing a single word of it. She'll lay low for a while, he said. Long enough to see whether the council holds her accountable for funding it, which they won't, because she's covered her trail too well for that, and long enough to see whether this changes anything about how seriously this territory takes its queen. Something in the way he said the word, careful and proud in equal measure, made Ren's chest tighten. The second council meeting happened a week after the first, called this time not by summons but by Alaric's own formal request, a petition asking the council to recognize, beyond mere theoretical acknowledgement, that the binding had been tested under genuine threat and had held completely. Ren stood before the same long table, the same dozen ancient faces, but something in the room felt different this time, less like an interrogation, and more like an audience waiting patiently to be convinced of something they already suspected, deep down, was true. Tell us what happened in that warehouse, the eldest woman said, the same one who had asked Ren what was actually true between her and Alaric the first time. Not what Lord Kane did, what you did while you waited. Ren hadn't expected the question at all, hadn't prepared an answer for it the way she'd carefully prepared for questions about lineage and law. I sat in a car and trusted someone with my brother's life, she said honestly. That's not heroic. It's not the kind of thing that gets written into history books. But it was the hardest thing I've ever done. Harder than running. Harder than leaving Marcus. Because it meant believing, completely and without reservation, that someone else could carry a weight I'd spent years convinced only I could carry alone. I was wrong about that for most of my life. I'm not wrong about it anymore. The dark-haired lord who had tested her so harshly before spoke again, though his tone had shifted into something less hostile, more genuinely curious. And if Lord Kane had failed that night, if your brother hadn't come out of that warehouse alive, then I would have grieved for the rest of my entire life, and I would have known, completely, that he'd done everything a person could possibly do to prevent it. That's not nothing. That's actually everything. She looked at Alaric as she said it, and watched something in his expression soften past careful composure into something entirely unguarded. The eldest woman rose slowly from her seat, the rest of the council watching her with the particular deference reserved for someone whose judgment had outlasted most of their own lifetimes several times over already. I asked you once what was true between you, she said. I find I no longer need to ask. The council recognizes Ren Calloway Kane as queen consort of these territories, fully and without reservation, effective from this moment forward. The vote that followed was unanimous, even from the dark-haired lord, even from voices that had questioned her the hardest only a week earlier. Outside the chamber, Alaric pulled her into his arms with a fierceness that had nothing to do with ceremony or politics at all, his face pressed into her hair. I love you, he said, the words arriving plainly, without the careful architecture he usually built around anything that mattered most to him, not because the binding decided it, because it's true, And it's been true since long before either of us understood what was actually happening between us. I love you too, Ren said, and meant it completely. The words feeling less like a confession and more like something finally catching up to what her body had quietly known for weeks already. 2 years later, Ren stood in the same study where the binding had first taken hold, except the candles this time were lit for an entirely different reason, and the dress she wore had been chosen rather than borrowed. Deep blue silk that Greta had insisted on for the formal wedding neither the law nor the council had actually required, but that Ren had wanted anyway. A ceremony built purely for the two of them rather than for any court's recognition or approval. Eli stood beside her as the only family she had left in the world, 16 now, taller than her by a full head, wearing a suit he'd complained about for an entire week and secretly loved anyway. He'd grown into himself in ways that still surprised her some mornings, the particular confidence of a kid who no longer flinched at sudden movements, who'd learned that the adults around him could actually be trusted to show up when it mattered. He'd taken to calling Alaric the old man with the specific affection only teenagers could manage, and Alaric, to Ren's endless amusement, had never once corrected him. "You ready for this?" Eli asked, adjusting his collar for the third nervous time. "Ask me again in about 5 minutes." He laughed, the easy laugh of someone whose heart, both the literal one and whatever else counted, had finally been given room to be young instead of constantly vigilant. "He's going to cry. You know that, right? 300 years old and he's going to absolutely cry. I'm counting on it," Ren said, and meant it. The ceremony itself was small, held in the garden behind the house rather than the council chamber. Greta and a handful of people who'd become something like family over 2 years, standing as witnesses instead of nobility. Alaric waited at the end of the aisle in dark formal clothes, and when Ren walked toward him, she watched exactly what Eli had predicted happen. Watched centuries of careful composure give way entirely to something raw and unguarded and human in every way that mattered. "You found me sleeping on your floor with $20 and nothing else," she said, when they'd reached the part of the ceremony meant for their own words instead of borrowed ones. "I thought I had nothing that night. I thought I'd lost everything worth having." "You had everything that mattered," Alaric said, his voice rough in a way she'd only heard a handful of times in 2 years. Courage, stubbornness, the kind of strength that doesn't announce itself, that just keeps getting up every single morning no matter what the night before cost you. You just needed someone to actually see it. "You saved me. You saved yourself," he corrected. The same words he'd say more than once over the years that followed, words that had become something like a private vow between them, long before this ceremony made anything official. I just refused to look away once I saw what was actually there. After the ceremony, after the small dinner and the toasts and Eli's deeply embarrassing speech about chemistry homework and burned French toast that didn't even apply to their household but he insisted on anyway, Ren found Alaric alone by the window, looking out at the garden the way he used to look out at the city in the early days. Except his expression now held none of the old weariness she'd first mistaken for simple stillness. "Do you ever think about that, Allie?" she asked, joining him. "Every day." He didn't look away from the window. Worst night either of us had in years. Best night of my entire existence, because it's the night I found you. He turned to face her fully. "I keep the $20 bill, you know, in my desk. I never told you that." "You kept it?" "Of course I did. It's where everything actually started. $20, and the bravest woman I've ever encountered in 3 centuries of watching people come and go." Ren thought about everything that $20 had once represented, the absolute bottom of what a life could be reduced to, every door closed, every safety net gone completely, nothing left but her own 2 feet and a stranger's open service entrance. She thought about how far that single night had carried her, through fear and binding and council chambers, and a warehouse she still sometimes saw in dreams, all the way to a garden full of people who genuinely loved her. A brother who slept soundly now. A man who'd chosen her honestly and completely once he finally understood what choosing her actually meant. "We saved each other," she said finally. That's what I think it actually was, in the end. Not a rescue. Not really. Not in the way the story sounds when other people tell it. Just two people who'd both run out of reasons to keep going alone. Finding a reason to keep going together instead. "I think that's exactly what love does," Alaric said, pulling her close, his voice quiet against her hair. "It doesn't erase what came before it. It just makes sure you never have to carry the weight of it by yourself again." The garden settled into evening around them, lanterns flickering on as the sky deepened toward dark, Eli's laughter carrying faintly from somewhere near the dinner tables. Greta fussing over the leftover cake the way she fussed over everything she loved. Ren leaned into Alaric's shoulder and let herself simply exist there, unguarded, unafraid, finally and completely home. Happily ever after, she'd learned, wasn't a single moment a story arrived at, and then stopped. It was built the same way safety had been built that very first night. One small act of courage at a time. One yes at a time. Choice after choice after choice, for as long as both people kept choosing it. She intended to keep choosing it for as long as she possibly could,